What's up guys, it's David with MACkites, and today we're kicking off our Big Air Basics series, so let's jump into it. So with this new series, we're going to focus on big air kiting and what that means and the different progression within that. So really, I am no expert in this field, but I am trying to focus on this with my own kiting. And so I'm trying to take you guys along for the ride, and hopefully we can all sort of progress together, and I can give you any tricks, tips, lessons learned as I've tried to progress in this area, and would always love to also hear your guys' opinions and people's comments down below as we're all trying to work on this together. So the foundation of really big air is going to be the kite loops. So today we're going to talk about the basic kite loop. So there's already a great video on Intro to Kite Loops by Blake here on our page, so you can check that one out if you're just getting into kite loops. Today I'm going to give a little bit of my own opinions on pieces of just nuances as you're getting into big air and what that sort of means for your kite loops, and just my own small opinions on things. I'm not going to cover the basics in getting into kite loops. My assumption is if you're watching this video, you've already sort of gotten into kite loops a bit. You've probably watched Blake's video, maybe a few others, and you're starting off on your kite loops. But today we're going to talk about trying to go a little bit bigger with them and start building that foundation for things like kite loop laybacks, boogie loops, contra loops, boogie contras, and so on from there. So with the kite loop, really that of course means you're pulling that loop with your backhand versus your front hand, which is going to be a contra loop, and we can get into that in a different video. But really, some of the nuances with kite loops as you start to get into big air and tricks for big air is making sure you're getting those kite loops at, I would say, above the 5 to 6 meter height range. Below that are great for intro to kite loops or baby loops, whatever term you want to use for them. But they're kind of at that height where you're not fully swinging under the kite yet and needing to heli loop to get out of it. And so it's best to kind of perfect and get used to kite loops at that lower height range, in that 2-3 meter range, where you're not high enough up that you're relying on the swing of the kite to catch you, and that you can still come down safely and nicely. It's that mid-range that you have to be a little bit careful on, where you're high enough that you're going to free fall after the loop, but you're not quite high enough that the kite is going to climb and catch you in time. So do please be careful in that range. And there's a lot of videos online kind of explaining that, so I won't get too deep into that. We're going to focus on what we need to do to have steady and reliable kite loops for that 6 and above meter range as we start progressing into tricks. The start of all of these is always going to come from your edge and pop. Really, it's about getting a good clean takeoff, getting as vertical as you can. And the big thing for me that I learned while doing this was I realized I was always tending to pull my kite loops pretty late because I was afraid of the yank at first, as well as thinking I needed to make sure I got all the way to as high as I could be. So this is one of the first things that I think it's important to think about, is pulling that loop a little bit earlier, because if you wait until that moment of your highest peak, that's when you kind of get that weightless feeling when you're jumping, and that means that there's not as much line tension, because really you and the kite have come up and then now you're starting to sink down, so there's that peak of the jump where like the line tension isn't as strong, which means that when you pull that loop, it's not going to loop as fast because there's just not as much tension on the kite. I would say you should shoot for pulling that loop at about 80% of your total jump height, and that's just going to take some getting used to. You can pull it earlier. Earlier is going to create more yank out of the loop. However, you have more time because your velocity is already shooting you up, so you have a bit more time for the kite to catch you and everything. It's just going to feel a bit more intense. So that's number one of kind of small tips and tricks for this. Number two is going to be making sure that kite is at noon, or even potentially a little bit before noon when you pull the loop. I think a lot of us run into this where we've gotten our jump timing down, we've gotten different aspects together for how to really try to get good clean jumps, especially when we're doing regular tricks, because we tend to overshoot the kite a little bit, because we know when we let go of your backhand for grabs and rotations, you're gonna end up slightly pulling on the front hand anyway, so it's gonna make that kite float back in front of you as you come down for your landing. So there's kind of no penalty in that world for overshooting the kite a little bit. However, when you start getting into kite loops and bigger loops especially, waiting until or overshooting that kite a little bit is actually gonna cause the loop to be lower, and you're gonna waste a lot of the total energy of the loop in that moment. Because what happens is, let's say we're riding, and as we jump and we shoot the kite over, if it's too far behind us, when you loop, that loop is going to be low and behind you, and also it's going to create a force that's back in the opposite direction that we were riding. So if you're riding this way, you jump and the loop is over too far to your backhand side, you're creating a tension that's opposite each other. So it's sort of energy that could have been used to go higher, or energy that could have been used to keep the kite in a position where it's going to be safer and it's going to catch you. So I think tip number 2 is really thinking about, where is that kite when I pull the loop, and do I need to adjust my timing? Do I need to pay attention to how the pressure is on the bar with both hands before I pull that loop, such that, you know, you're jumping and keeping that kite up at 12 or even a little bit before it, so that loop is really centered and straight downwind of you. So that's tip number 2. Tip number 3 is really thinking about sheeting out on after the loop and how much you need to, because I think as you get higher, you'll start to realize you don't need to sheet out quite as much in order to get the kite to climb, and so it can swing back under you. This really just comes with playing with which kind of kite you have, how fast is that kite going to rise. Like for me, I'm riding the North Orbits. They tend to climb really fast, so I don't have to sheet out quite as much usually to get that kite to climb, but some other kites just want that pressure release off the steering lines, but it will cause them to rise very quickly. And so some of it's going to come down to which kite you're riding and what that kite needs in order to rise, such that you can get caught with it. So as you get into doing higher kite loops, I think it's important to make sure to practice them in both directions. And one thing that I found easiest for me in terms of working on those bigger kite loops is, so I'm a regular rider. I like to ride going left foot forward, and I like those for my landings a lot better. It's where I'm more comfortable. It's important to be comfortable with both, but for as you're starting, it's nice to land and plan to land going to your strong side, because it's just overall a little bit more comfortable and gives you a little bit more room for error in terms of being able to ride out landings. And what's nice is being able to, or going for those kite loops starting with your opposite direction and using it as a transition, because what's going to happen is you'll pull that loop with your backhand. So let's say we're going to the right, we're going to jump, pull the loop with your backhand. As the loop comes around, you're going to sheet out, and then because you're going to want to land as a transition, you can pull your heli loop with your front hand, and so it'll make it a clean landing. You'll untwist the lines essentially that what you'd put in from the loop, so you land, everything's opened up, the kite's going to fly easy and smooth. And really, I think that's kind of the best way to get started into the little bit bigger kite loops. So I think that's about it for my quick tips on kite loops, and this is really just the beginning to our big air series, as I talked about. So we're going to progress into some future tricks and some different big air aspects. So with that, if you want to see the gear that I'm riding from MACkites, check the link below. If you have any comments, questions, feel free to put them in here, and we'll make sure to try to respond, and would love to make this interactive during this overall big air series, because I'm learning just as much as you guys are, and so let's see what we can all do together.